Our first keynote speaker today is Niki Frantzeskaki. Niki is an associate professor of sustainability transitions governance at Drift, the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. Niki is coordinating research on environmental governance and urban sustainability transitions. She's going to come and talk to us for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to have time for questions with Niki.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. Thank you for waking up after the day one party yesterday night. And as Julia already announced, I'm going to take over and set the scene for more discussions on the governance aspect of leverage points. As also in the title of my presentation is about the processes, it's about leveraging the transformation. I'm going to this is not exactly, okay, super. So just to go one more slide, I'm going to focus on 3 key points as a keynote presentation today on the value of co-production, what we know and what we would like to know in the future. Also in terms of giving space to new research questions and new research directions. What does it mean to have changing and broadening roles for research, for local governments, and for civil society in the context of transformations? And also, how do we move beyond experimentation? We know that experimentation is very important, and we hear it again and again. Yesterday was quite dominant in all the discussions, but what is our next step in that? I'm going to build from research mainly in cities. As you see in this slide, is quite of a repertoire on case study research in urban settings, asking transformation questions. I will build from these grounds, sometimes on single case study research, most of the times on cross-case comparative research, but I'm not going to dive into the methodologies or all the methodological architecture. I will be very happy to have more discussions on that during the discussion corner time. So let's start. Co-production as a mode of governance. How this resonates in the context of transition. In a number of sessions I've been yesterday, we talked a lot about co-creation, co-production of knowledge, co-production of sustainable solutions. The first reason is that we are not, as scientists anymore, hold the absolute truth. Neither we are expert knowledge has a dominant stage. We build and we need and we require to wave in different types of knowledge. At the same time, by having all these different, diverse and very capacitated agents of change, we need to create and we need to bring them together so as to have this social shaping of sustainable solutions. Co-production creates and facilitates exactly this, while at the same time strengthens the evidence-based decision-making processes that a lot of cities and a lot of governments actually base their strategies and sustainability plans nowadays. But at the same time, by working closely with initiatives, with social innovation entrepreneurs, we look at when these sustainable solutions, when these innovations, they are co-produced, are actually creating more just transformations. Transformations that are more inclusive, that they leave no people behind, even if they are in localities. And this is a lesson for us to look more closely. How can these processes actually become more mainstreamed into governance processes? And this resonates more and more in 2 major drivers in our era. We are living in an urban planet. The rate of urbanization is quite high and, of course, at the same time, very diverse across the globe. In a project that we concluded within Future Earth with an urban group, working in co-production mode with a big number of contributors, we arrived to the conclusion that in order to have a more secure, sustainable urban future, we do need integrated, actionable knowledge. Co-production is one of the processes that can actually facilitate this. At the same time, we do experience the climate change pressing impacts. And even though the IPCC report is already pushing and having strong recommendations of what we need to change for achieving the Paris climate goal, there are also quite some heavy research of how can we prepare for high-end extreme climate change. In the Impressions projects, one of these projects actually stimulated from the IPCC discussions, looking on what it will mean for our planet if we combine a quite diverse set of socioeconomic scenarios with extreme high-end climate change of 4.5 degrees with 8.5 degrees, 4.2 and 8.5. We embarked on a 5-year co-production process across 4 regions in Europe, so as exactly to respond to this question. What do we need to navigate to prepare European society in these different high-end climate change contexts? And what we found across all these 4 regions and in this very heavy and very intense co-production process is the synergy between 3 dominant pathways: the shift to sustainable lifestyles, not externalizing costs in the nexus of food, water, and energy, and not change, but strengthen environmental governance. You might say nothing of these 3 pathways is exactly surprising, but what it is surprising is seeing how they come together as a common agenda across 4 regions, also reflecting on which type of European policies, local policies, and regional policies need to be reformulated, enriched, and strengthened. So what this co-production process showed us, and also inform a number of European Union discussions on directives, is how it brings about this collaborative creativity and also produce with this synergy, with this waving in of the knowledges, this authentic, but at the same time connected solutions. And of course, I am quite of a big proponent of co-production. I've been working with co-production methods, with co-production concepts, but there's still a lot of things we need to do, especially if we want to continue leveraging the transition and deepening the knowledge we have on that. The first is about the metrics of co-production. How do we assess the quality of a co-production process? There is all this big discussion about actionable outputs, about usable outputs, but what about the procedural quality and how these two can come together, process and content? At the same time, I don't know how many of you have been engaged in co-production as also a research architecture, as a research structure, but we do need more systematization of the research methods we are using. Then, if we look on co-production of knowledge, producing all these actionable, usable, and usable outputs, they are the new commons, meaning they belong to everybody. But if they belong to everybody, then who gets awarded? Who owns the outputs and in which way? At the same time, we look a lot on the debates about what co-production means for science, the role of researchers, and quite of an emerging debate about the democratization of science, the science for society. And you might say, come on, don't be naive. We have not been always on the apoliticization of science. It has always had a role to play on politics, on the welfare, and also on the future of how society and sustainability look. But actually, we need to start asking the more critical questions. What is the value system of science in the era of co-production? Moving to my second point, and we all have quite a lot of reflections on how the role of scientists is changing, especially when you talk about navigating, instigating sustainability transitions, but at the same time from working very closely with cities and very closely with multiple actors in cities, and agents of change, we see that the roles of civil society, of businesses, of local governments is shifting over the years. Working with cities a lot, I have to actually admit that I have seen some very fascinating changes there. Cities are not only on regulating, on implementing solutions, but they also take a very active research role. The city networks that are emerging, and they are also getting stronger and stronger, from the 100 resilient cities to C40 to cities for climate change to the urban platform. I can just go on and on. They do have a research and knowledge agenda. It's not just an advocacy or a political agenda, it's also a knowledge and research agenda. Cities are also not just facilitating pilots or piloting, but they also facilitate the research with experimentation, something that makes a number of researchers call them the research municipalities or the research turn in city government. On the researchers, apart from doing our discovery inquiry, we are also finding, especially the people who work more closely with co-creation, with co-production, having also an extension to our roles. It is and about the co-production, and about intermediation, and about translation of knowledge to what it means for practice, what it means for policy. So our role is not only changing, but is also broadening. And another fascinating thing that it also builds from what we heard yesterday with the seeds of good Anthropocene, with social innovation initiatives, is this changing role of civil society. It goes beyond advocating. It goes into pioneering new types of solutions and also servicing where the welfare state is retreating. We have seen civil society and especially social innovation taking a very active role in the forefront of sustainability transformations. Research we have been doing at Drift and in the social innovation research team with a lot of research networks, we have been actually confronting exactly this hypothesis. We brought together 8 different large-scale projects in social innovation and on transition initiatives. We did a very meta-analysis and on what is written on civil society, but also on contemporary cases on social innovation to exactly confront and find what are these new roles of civil society. And we find that they are change agents, not because of advocacy, but because they're actually the makers of social innovation, the makers of evidence that sustainable solutions work, that can be scaled and that can be transferred. But if we look on these changing roles, then of course we question again, if my role is changing, do I still fit on the institution that I'm about to serve, or that I have to somehow conform to the rules of this institution? So the questions we have been asking more and more, at least as researchers, is I want to do research with co-production, but then I don't exactly fit on my faculty. But then the faculties and the disciplines are really rigid. They are proposing interdisciplinary research, but actually I never fit on the criteria. Maybe it's about time we ask different questions, especially because our broadening and changing roles, the way we are fulfilling these roles, the way we confront these roles, is also a leverage point for the broader transformation. We are all part in this. So what about rethinking the institutions from rule-based to role-oriented? What about thinking what would be the new award systems for scientists in the era of co-production? And also, how can we facilitate what would be these institutional spaces to allow social innovation pioneers to actually thrive, to actually help in forming the institutions that are really required for accelerating, for pushing the sustainability transition forward. And my third point is about all these actors, is about post-experimentation. Why? Because if we look on co-production, you might say is a mode of governance experimentation and research experimentation at the same time. If we look on all these different roles actors are taking, experimentation also plays a role there, but is not, of course, a defining driver behind it. But more and more we listen on the narrative that in order to find out how to change the old and how to set up and settle the new, experimentation is a way forward. And we have seen a proliferation of experiments in cities, in nations, and across a lot of different sustainable solutions, from smart cities to circular economy to sharing economy, to nature-based solutions, to renewable energy. Experimentation has been there with different shapes, with different forms. And for very good reasons, especially if we look on the impact experimentation brings. It creates evidence and is also a way to empower and create the space for new novelty, not only to be trialed, but actually to be institutionalized. In recent research, especially on urban regeneration in deprived neighborhoods around Europe, I work with 11 cities. They set up more than 50 experiments so as to see how to actually deal with the policy trauma of policy failure, when they have a lot of social policy actually not working in areas that matter the most for their cities. They went through experimentation so as to find which of the institutions that they have in place they're still valid, which they need to be reformulated. The question after 5 years working with the cities is, and now what do? We have a lot of lessons. We open up to new relationships with the citizens, with the different civil society groups that they work there. And what do we do now? Okay, now the experiment finished. We saw it as a project, was successful, and then what? The same goes, of course, with if we look on a lot of successful examples of nature-based solutions in cities, especially on urban renaturing, on urban greening, on renewing infrastructure for flood protection, for climate mitigation. We see a lot of these successful examples being showcased around Europe. We did a mapping of more than 2,000 cases, and we found that only 350 of them have actually been upscaled. So that also confronted a hypothesis that if we want to look on the impact or the success of experimentation, is scaling up a way to look and unpack it? Well, it's almost a way, but it's not the only way. We still don't know what would be the processes to sustain the impact of experiments and the transformative capacity of experiments when they actually go post-experimentation. In research we did in 5 cities on how can we accelerate the transition by looking from the survived transition initiatives across different environmental domains, we look on different mechanisms of how can you sustain the impact of transformative solutions. What we empirically found is that we talk about the replication, we talk about the social institutional shaping of the approaches used to actually evidence transformative solutions, but also how to strategically use the existing institutions and governance structures so as to make the transformative solutions survive and have impact in specific locations. And this brings me to the questions. Now that we do have a critical mass on experiments, that they come, of course, in different shapes and in different colors, from seeds of good Anthropocene to transition initiatives to social innovations to policy and governance pilots that cities lead to real-life laboratories. What are actually the conditions, the mechanisms, or the impact pathways to sustain their transformative capacity post-experimentation? What are the tools, the designs, and also the institutional spaces that are required? And of course, how do we go about post-experimentation? The theme of the day is about navigating the leverage points, navigating the sustainability transition. Can we experiment for post-experimentation? Is still experimentation a tool, a mode of governance to talk about destabilization? Making space for this impact of experiments to be sustained? Do we only look at how to empower, or do we also look how to destabilize? And how do we do this? So I hope this at least spurs some inspiration for you, and not only on how to understand the current state of research on transformations, but also what would be the leverage points to deepen and to bring forward for our future research on transformations. And I hope to have the opportunity to discuss some of them with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Niki. We have a little bit of time left over for Niki to answer questions. What I would suggest is we will maybe take a couple of questions from the floor and then give Niki time to answer them. And then we'll see how we're doing for time, if there's time for another round. We have microphones on standby, right? So perhaps if you are interested in asking a question of Niki, could you stand up now, please? Okay, what I would like is to direct one microphone over here and then to the back as well. So, yeah, you can choose who.
Yeah, I cannot say who is first. So
Yeah.
It's also this light is quite...
Okay.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question regarding a co-creation approach instead of a co-production approach, because I think it's very important to engage with the communities in co-creating the questions for research as well. Because I think very often we think this is the problem, and we think, okay, let's try to find a solution for the problem, but actually we do not really know which are the problems, and we need to co-create it with a larger community. And I think, again, the process of governance will be much more effective. And yeah, what is your point on this?
I cannot agree more, I have to say. And framing the question in a collaborative way, in an open way, together with communities, I think this is actually the foundation step of transdisciplinary research. And I don't find a point of disagreement there. I think it does, of course, depend on how you design your research, what is the value, the knowledge that communities bring. And communities is not only the layman, the local community, but it can be also a community of interest, a community of practice. And of course, keeping open questions and keeping the mind on the discovery as scientists, I think this is something that has to motivate us and has to drive us as transformation researchers. So I agree, yes. Nothing to disagree about.
Thanks, Niki. Oh, thanks, Niki, for the thought-provoking talk in the middle.
Can you wave? Okay. Hi.
Hello. I wonder if you'd given any thought, if you have any reflections on the broadening roles of the private sector. So much of the finance and the funding resources are sitting in the private sector, and how that fits within this broadening role landscape in the stakeholder space.
Yes, thank you. Well, I have to say I haven't yet concluded the research on the role of small, medium enterprises in sustainability transitions. Colleagues from Canada, Sarah Birch, that's not here, is leading this. And what we found by doing a survey of sustainable businesses and businesses that they want to embark into more sustainable practices is that their role is also changing, even though they're very much stereotyped into the evil, the bad end of sustainability. Actually, there is a lot of businesses that they actually are front runners, and they make very large-scale impact into changing practices, into changing the way they deal with resource extraction, but also with resource circularity. And this is definitely something to also look more closely. So what I can confirm is that it does changing, it does play a big role on how transitions are driven and how transitions are reoriented. They do need to have a seat on the table of co-creation and co-production, but I cannot say more because I have to say this is also a little bit of my blind spot or the spot to discover more.
Hi, Niki. Thank you. And I want to go back to co-production and co-creation of knowledge in academia itself. You asked really crucial questions about the future of academic institution. And we have been hearing about the need for viewing knowledge from different speakers and acknowledging other types of knowledge. But my question is, I guess, there's also a not very well scrutinized emphasis on science. And I think it's wonderful that there is an indigenous knowledge track in this conference, but it's still marginalized. You know, it's framed around and put as a track, and in other tracks we hear about researchers going into indigenous communities with their own impositions, methodological impositions, worldview impositions. So there's not that mainstreaming of going on. We also heard yesterday about how we can represent artistic research in scientific ways. So this is also a form of colonization. And I'm really wondering about your own reflections on how we can acknowledge different epistemological different epistemologies in our academic work and not colonize different ways of knowing and producing knowledge with our, I don't want to say scientific thinking because I think science is an important rule, but our scientism, let's say.
Yeah, that's an easy question, right? Like it's a nested question. Thanks, Idil, for that. Well, to start with, I think it is important to recognize, to have as a starting point the recognition that there are different types of knowledge. And to appreciate the different types of knowledge is already a step forward. And I think if we look on co-production and how to design different settings for co-production with this in mind, I think we'll be a step further. That a lot of research that has done on participatory governance, on collaborative research design, on transdisciplinarity. But at the same time, we need to also think on, by innovating on our research inquiry and in our methodologies, how can we still sustain into actually doing our research? So I think we are on the era to ask how to find a balance, how to systematize this without exactly going back to the comfort zone or remaining in the comfort zone of employing methods and tools that they marginalize local knowledge or experiential knowledge. I know from some colleagues from Barcelona, we worked together in the Impressions project, they did the performative methods for co-production, meaning they used arts, theater, and even expressionism. They use expressionism and painting and theater and dance as a way to co-produce scenario narratives on extreme climate change. So they brought experiential learning as a mode for the co-production. It was very outside the comfort zone, very difficult to systematize, but also very exciting. So there are movements, there are steps towards this direction, and I do believe that we need to be more daring, but at the same time we need to also systematize it.